For Global Business Update, Michael Wilson joins us now from London. Good morning, Michael.
Morning, gentlemen. So a bit of a low start, really, or a low finish to the week as far as Asia Pacific's concerned. Investors digesting the fact that the Bank of Japan interest rate decision, which I'll come on to, and a slew of companies in the region reporting earnings. In Australia, the S&P there was down about 0.5%. Nikkei fell about 1/3%. Basically, the Japanese yen trading at 146. That's stronger than levels seen last week, but the Bank of Japan has kept its interest rate at ultra low levels in line with expectations. It's doing that basically because it feels as though it needs to do it. I'll come on to it in a second. In mainland China, the Shanghai Composite 0.9% lower, and the Shenzhen Component fell by as much as about 2%. Still, I think digesting which way the economy in China is actually going and why there were no specific mentions during the Congress, which is now almost 2 weeks old, about where the economy is actually going. So as I was saying, the Bank of Japan sticking to its dovish stance as the rest of the world, including the ECB again, which I'll come on to, takes on jumbo hikes, left it actually completely unchanged. And all it's doing is it'll purchase government bonds to keep the long-term borrowing at its steady level. But the Japanese currency itself is hovering at 32-year lows. I suppose the question to ask really is when will the central bank have to take some kind of action to prevent inflation rising rapidly in Japan, because it's now a net importer of goods, including fuel and including consumer goods as well, and consumers who are unfortunately, well, fortunately or unfortunately, depending how you look at it, the centre of most economies are feeling the crunch. However, that said, S&P Global Market Intelligence, for what it's worth, is saying that Asia Pacific will lead global economic growth in 2023, 3.5% on average, apparently, and they think that Europe and the US will be likely facing recession. I'm not so sure about that, particularly as we got those relatively decent figures from the United States, but they could be flattering to deceive. Asia Pacific, I probably don't need to remind you, about 35% of the world GDP, and will certainly dominate as they dominate trade agreements, efficient supply chains, and competitive costs. Well, there we go. So the US and NASDAQ futures fell after some terrible guidance from Amazon, particularly what the Americans describe as the holiday season. I take this to mean what normal people talk about as being the Christmas period, but and bad guidance over that. So Amazon led it all down there, and Amazon is long now being seen as a bellwether of the strength of the US economy, and Apple shares down as well. So a bit of a brutal week for big tech shares, weaker than anticipated iPhone revenue, and the iPhone is something upon which, as you know, that company depends. However, the Dow up 194 points on the day in normal trading, not in futures. Shares of Caterpillar, McDonald's, and Honeywell led the feeling that, generally speaking, and that was on the back of those slightly improved GDP figures. Of course, they could just be a flash in the pan, and we wait to take a much more longer view over what's happening in the US economy. Elon Musk is now in charge of Twitter, according to most of the indications there. The company's got rid of its CEO and the CFO, and also the head of legal policy. He had until today to complete his 44 billion takeover, and it looks as though, well, it's heading like this. When you take over a company, you tend to cut out the fat, which is the management, and tends to be the higher ups. I mean, he doesn't need the experience of the CEOs, he's saying, but he does apparently need people to do the tech that Twitter actually depends on. So I think there is a future for engineers within the company that have taken it to where it is right now. Yesterday's news, in a sense, but it's worth mentioning that the European Central Bank hiked interest rates, fueling recession fears. However, the mood music, if I can use that dreadful phrase, is that Christine Lagarde says she was nevertheless concerned with a looming recession in the currency bloc, and the market sort of took that as being a relatively dovish pivot as far as the ECB is concerned. And we still, of course, the jury's out on Germany, Italy, France, and Spain, according to their, the major economies within the EU and where they're actually going at the moment. Here in the UK, now we know that budget, it is being called an autumn budget now, autumn budget statement, is being postponed until November the 17th. And Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, is apparently exploring tax rises and spending cuts. The Office of Budget Responsibility, he has to take notice of this now, whatever you happen to think about organisations like that. And they have had to take on board this, what is now a £50 billion black hole within the economy, and apparently is working with Jeremy Hunt. They met yesterday, and also Rishi Sunak has been accused of a failure of leadership after Number 10 said that he would not be attending the COP27 climate summit in Egypt next month. According to his officials, the PM has other pressing domestic commitments, including preparations for the autumn budget with a capital B. So it is being called a budget, as I suspected it probably would, which means that we're going to get a lot of information in that will be absolutely critical. And finally, as far as commodities are concerned, the oil prices are falling as the dollar climbs. You expect that, because oil tends to be paid for in dollars, but there are also supply concerns as well. And it's basically a weekly gain slightly for oil prices on these supply worries. That is the global view this morning.
All right, two things. Number one will be the UK economy. So I'd like to ask and interrogate the numbers. This 50 billion black hole, is it plus the 65 billion set aside by the Bank of England that they said they were supposed to spend, and they said they spent 7 billion to guide the gilt market? Is it plus that? How much is all of this coming back to in the end? Because I'm hearing 65 billion, I'm hearing 60 billion, 50 billion. So can we put those amounts together and say the shenanigan by Liz Truss is costing over 100 billion in the space of 3 weeks? Correct me if I'm wrong on that. Secondly, Putin did give a speech yesterday to a group in Russia. And he said a lot of things against the West and all of that. What effect did that briefing or speech have on the oil market? Did it have any effect? Did it move the needle? Because it looks as though Putin is still whipping up those sentiments he's always whipped up, and he wants to continue with the war.
Well, to answer your last question first, no effect whatsoever on the oil markets. Because it's very difficult to understand. I mean, you can hear what's being said, but they, first of all, didn't provide a translation of the speech, which you probably know. So it was down to people actually on site to translate what he was saying. And he went on a long time. He didn't have any effect on the oil market at all, because the general suspicion is that oil prices will rise as temperatures fall. So that's that. As far as gas is concerned, yes, we've been following the story about the various ships anchored and full of LNG and so on, from all various different sorts of sources. My energy analysts were telling me on Wednesday that the price of oil will increase because they're going to have to get it from different sources, because the ban takes place on December the 5th, and gas is flattering to deceive at the moment. It apparently went into negative price for about 10 minutes the other day, and is now back again. There is plenty of gas around at the moment. The difficulty is storage, but those ships are clearly waiting, as you would expect, until the price is right for them to come into port. As far as the UK economy is concerned, I mean, maybe even the $50 billion is not right. These are only estimates, and people are usually wrong about estimates. The 65 billion that the bank thought it might spend and didn't. Clearly, we'll have to see what they will tell us they have actually spent, and I suspect the Monetary Policy Committee will tell us that later in the middle of next week when we get the interest rate decision from the Bank of England. And generally speaking, if you want to talk about that very, very briefly, it looks as though the economy is not in quite as bad a shape, and it may not be the 50 billion. And if it's not the 50 billion, which is the outside estimate from the Office of Budget Responsibility, then the interest rate rise, which is inevitable, of course, will only be 0.5% rather than 0.75%. And other markets are saying this morning, certainly not the 1% a lot of people had been fearing. That doesn't really, I understand, it doesn't really complete the circle because there's a lot of uncertainty about all this. But to try to answer your question, I think the 50 billion is the worst case scenario, but they are working towards that because what they've realised, thank goodness they've realised this, is that fiscal credibility is the most valuable commodity.
Well, Michael, I have three issues, but we have very limited time, but I'll go to them straight. Now, what should we expect with Twitter under Elon Musk, who calls himself Mr. Tweet or the Chief Tweet? You talked about engineering, but you said also he's cutting fat. But he's also talking about application X, the application that will provide for everything. He's a free speech absolutist. What is that likely to look like? And he wants to turn Twitter into whatever. That's one. Two, the Japanese yen. The Japanese, they have cut interest rates to zero. They've done so consistently. They've gone against the grain, the same way in which Turkish President Erdogan, has gone against the orthodoxy. Now, do they have any advantages at all? Now that the Japanese yen is, very weak against the dollar. The received orthodoxy is that when you have higher interest rates, you strengthen your currency. And finally, Rishi Sunak says he doesn't want to go to the Conference of the Parties Summit in Sheikh al-Sham in Egypt. Is it an indication, a clear indication of the concerns expressed before he even emerged about his lack of commitment to the net zero policy, of his commitment to the green policy, and is this really a good thing? Is this a show that Great Britain is really not committed to the net zero policy?
Can you remember anything from COP26? Because I certainly can't, and I think concerns have moved on, because I don't know what COP27 is going to achieve, quite honestly. But no, to answer your question about that, apparently, according to Downing Street, this is not a reflection. He doesn't think climate change is important or unimportant. It's a fact that he needs to actually get down to work. And I think most people quite admire that kind of thing in a prime minister, to say, look, as far as I'm concerned, yeah, I get all the stuff about COP27, but actually my proper work is going to be here to fix the economy first of all. So I would think, if I were in charge of policy at number 10, that's the advice that I would have been giving. Forget COP27. That's fine. Nice time in Egypt, and it's a very nice resort because I've been there myself. I had a very nice time to be had there. But actually, the real granular work is getting down to this, and that's what he said. His father-in-law is famous for saying, you remember he married the billionaire daughter, and he's famous for saying, in God we trust, the rest can bring data to the table. Yeah. Right? I think that we should probably remember that. As far as Twitter is, Japan, I have no idea. I mean, I feel the same about it as you do. It's not quite entering the Turkish form of orthodoxy, but it's almost there. I feel absolutely certain that the Bank of Japan will have to act. All the moment is they're just they're steering the economy with their own bond market. I think they will have to take some fairly serious monetary decisions fairly soon. As far as Twitter's concerned, I have absolutely no idea. Let me put it to you like this. I was listening to an American talking on the radio earlier this morning, and the guy, the interviewer in my position was saying, no, what all that Musk wants to do is to make money out of Twitter in whichever way he can. The American said, I think this is quite interesting. He said, no, you misunderstand. If you're that rich, you don't need to make any more money. He can actually do with it as he wishes. And he can be, as you are suggesting in your introductory part of this question, can become the champion of free speech should he so wish. He could be making Twitter for all mankind. I mean, it sounds crazy when we look at data and we look at money and we look at income and outgoings and all the rest of it and balancing balance sheets and so on. But he could just be doing that. To answer your question, I have absolutely no idea. But getting rid of senior management is what you do in times of cutting away the fat and so on. The grist of what's going on is keeping hold of the people who actually operate Twitter, the engineers and the tech boffins who keep it going. That's what he's building. Where it's going, nobody knows. It'll go private. That's all I know.
Well, thank you very much, Michael Wilson. Now for business updates across the African continent, Rotus Odiri joins us. Good morning, Rotus.
Good morning, Doctor. Good morning, Rufai. Good morning to all our viewers. Yeah, so just following up from yesterday, we've seen a fall in the Naira. You can call it a knee-jerk reaction to the announcement of the redesign of the notes. And yes, Rufai, I know you mentioned that yesterday. I'm sure that's the first thing you're going to tell me. But look, the factors that have led to the depreciation of the currency on the official and parallel markets have been there before this announcement was made with respect to the redesign of the notes. So perhaps it is this anecdotal talk of a number of folks scrambling to get FX in order to offload the amount of cash that they have. But then that's already within the context of people demanding personal travel allowance, paying school fees overseas, healthcare demands, coming towards the festive season and so on and so forth. So you can couch that all within that same conversation. So again, this is within 24 hours. So I talked to a couple BDCs, different ranges I was getting from 770 to 785 and so on and so forth. So we'll just see how that changes and monitor it through the rest of the day and then going into next week as well, especially the closer we get to the December 15th threshold for the new notes that's going to go into effect, and then also for January 30, the end of January of next year, when the old notes are no longer in circulation. So again, it's just something that needs to be monitored in the short, medium, and long term. We were supposed to today. I particularly was looking forward to the Lagos Chamber of Commerce and Industry address from the presidential candidates of the ruling All Progressive Congress, Asiwaju Bola Ahmed Tinubu. But unfortunately, it was postponed, and there's no new dates that has been given. As you know, we covered this here. Atiku Abubakar, presidential candidate of the People's Democratic Party, he addressed the LCCI. We covered it. He took questions. He talked about his economic plans. The presidential candidate of the Labour Party, Peter Obi, he also addressed the LCCI as well. He took questions and he talked about his economic plans. But we are yet to hear from Asiwaju Bola Ahmed Tinubu, and the private sector wants to hear from him. I personally, look, again, when I talked about his manifesto, remember I got pretty excited about the radical, the radical proposal to remove the oil benchmark rate from the budget, which completely talks about, reorienting the medium-term expenditure framework. I wanted to ask him, okay, what are you going to do about adjusting spending to needs rather than using an oil benchmark? What does that mean for inflation? So I don't know when I'm going to get those answers. And I guess the rest of the private sector is also wondering when we'll hear from Asiwaju Bola Ahmed Tinubu. So I think you made a call the other day, wasn't it? You, both of you, actually. We've calling on him to please talk to the public about his economic plans and how he plans to defend them. Egypt, our favorite topic, and the IMF, $3 billion extended credit facility agreed yesterday. part of a 46-month facility with assistance. They've been talking to the IMF since March. You've seen how the war in Ukraine, the Russia invasion of Ukraine, has impacted Egypt. Egypt is Africa's largest importer of wheat, and their finances have been, badly hit. And so, but the IMF, right? We talk about this all the time. The IMF, they say, okay, here, take this $3 billion. Oh, wait. Before I give you this $3 billion, you have to devalue your currency. And then they're like, okay, take. No, wait. Before you do that, no, you're going to have to remove fuel subsidies. So, look at this chart here. These are non-deliverable forwards. NDFs are essentially offshore trading of a currency. They are bets on the movement. The black line is the NDFR, right? Like that. Look at you can see at the right there, it goes all the way to almost 24 Egyptian pounds to the dollar. The red line is the spot rate, and that is not too far away, about 22.5. You can see where in March they devalued the currency from about 15.5 Egyptian pounds. They devalued to about 18.5 back in March, and you can see that big jump there. It was trading between January and March. It was about stable, about 15, but then that jump, and now look at where it's been since that time, and then look at this last spike with the announcement of the deal. Now, the Egyptian Central Bank says they will move to a flexible exchange rate, and that's why you've seen the pound sliding. Now, they promised this back in 2016 when they got their last assistance from the IMF, but they didn't float the pound. They just adjusted they were still using a peg, but now the IMF has been adamant that they must move to a flexible exchange rate. They said that, in fact, to quote the IMF, that it is the cornerstone of an improvement in the fiscal structure of the nation for them to basically float their currency. So the Egyptian Central Bank says they will do that. Where is inflation in Egypt? It's about 15%, I think, or 16%. So it's pretty high, and they need the money. So they finally got the money. We're all looking at Ghana now. Ghana has been talking to the IMF. Tunisia has been talking to the IMF. So we'll see how that works out. We move to South Africa. The Johannesburg Stock Exchange is altering its listing rules in order to attract more initial public offerings. There have been a number of delistings on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, which, by the way, is the most capitalized stock exchange on the African continent. $1 trillion with a T. So, for example, they want to reduce free float requirements. A free float is the amount of shares that are held by the public, as opposed to shares that are locked in with private investors with a firm. So they want to move that, for example, from about 20% free float to 15%. They also want to alter rules around SPACs, special purpose acquisition companies, which look for a company to latch onto before they go public. They're kind of volatile, kind of risky, but they want to alter that in line with the West in order to bring more companies. So you can see, we talked about William Ruto in Kenya, who said he wanted to bring more companies to the Nairobi Securities Exchange. Now you've got the Johannesburg Stock Exchange as biggest exchange in Africa. They are still looking for more companies to list on the exchange. So the stock market is a priority of any country, and it's important for leadership in that country to prioritize bringing more firms, because you deepen your market, you add depth, you add more liquidity. It helps a lot, and then companies are able to raise money that way. And still in South Africa, we'll wrap up with Enoch Godongwana, his budget speech Wednesday. They are on a collision course with unions. The South African government, as you know, they are also facing their own issues. They had decided, and in his speech, that inflation index wages are only going to increase by about 3.3% on average. The unions are asking for 6 to 10%. And the conversation has been because, South Africa's inflation for September, I think it eased just a bit, but it's 7.5% from August when it was in 7.6. So they're saying that, listen, inflation is rising and you need to increase it in line with that. They're saying that they're going to keep it at 3.3. So there is going to be a standoff at some point. Which brings me to Nigeria. Whenever we talk about unions here, your NLCs and so on and so forth, they've never really had an inflation-linked conversation. It's usually, okay, the minimum wage is the minimum wage. It's too low and it needs to rise. But
because they're never strong on the arguments.
yeah, they're not. And it's really, it's really curious because and we don't even need to go to the West. We've talked about South Africa. They're saying, the unions are saying, listen, inflation is here. We need wages to be here. In Tunisia, the UGTT, the labor union came out and said, listen, our purchasing power is going down and inflation, I can't remember what inflation is in Tunisia. No. Is it we're not sophisticated enough? We don't understand it? It's not, why is that?
The arguments are always bland. The arguments are always, and please, this is not a stereotyping. Please don't get me wrong. I know this is going to draw a reaction. This is going
you draw a lot of reactions on social media. You're a star.
Because the arguments are just in Soweto and it stops there.
Yeah,
that's the argument. It's not about that. It's about engagement, one, with the government, about the prospect of the economy, and that's why when you ask a lot of labor leaders, they're dead on the arguments. Prospect of the economy, then how can you use wage to index against inflation?
Right.
And those are the conversations. And that's why you see that the conversation about minimum wage itself, and I think we also need to redirect that conversation. Is it really feasible? Is it a minimum wage or a living wage?
Yeah.
I mean, those are the conversations we should put on the table, but we don't put it on the table enough, and it's neither here nor there. So it's like, okay, increase minimum wage.
Yeah.
If you can increase minimum wage to a certain extent, then we meet halfway. But the conversation on inflation is not hedged, as regards minimum wage and the likes. I think probably the only people that are getting that conversation on inflation right to a certain extent are the pension fund administrators that account for inflation when they're having their hedge and things like that, and in their returns. So only the pension fund administration, but the labor unions is lost on them. And like I said before, this is not to disparage the labor union. Conversation only stops at in Soweto.
But can they see that this conversation happening elsewhere? It's weird.
It's bad news for Cyril Ramaphosa
in South Africa.
Who is facing now a threat of strike from COSATU, the Coalition of South African Trade Unions, and also from the Public Service Association. He's going for, there'll be general elections again in, I think, 2024 in South Africa. So if you have issues with the trade unions, then you have problems. That's number one. Number two, however, is that the government is proposing a 3.3% wage increase, which the unions are saying is not enough.
Right.
If you give us 3.3 and inflation is at this level, then you are not meeting it. The third argument that everyone should note is that wage indexation in itself could be a problem. It is natural, as you have seen in the UK and elsewhere, for people to say, oh, if inflation goes up, then the employer of labor must match inflation. But that wage indexation, that's what it is called, theoretically, can be a self-fulfilling prophecy. So if inflation today is at 8% and it goes up next month to 10%, so you increase salary again. If it goes to 11%, you increase salary again. So how do you handle such a situation? For example, in Turkey, where inflation is close to 100% now, well over 80%, or in Sri Lanka, where it is about 83%, and the government does not have a problem. So there's a practical side to it, whereby people say, well, there's inflation. You have to match it. And the other side, where government says we cannot go beyond our resources. So it's a problematic thing. And governments all over the world are learning to find a balance. And here in Nigeria, okay, even if you say do wage indexation, even minimum wage has not been paid. Cost of living, even in the UK, has not been met. So it's a very difficult area of macroeconomics. Second, you talked about Asiwaju Bola Ahmed Tinubu saying he could not make Lagos Chamber of Commerce and Industry. Well, the same Lagos Chamber of Commerce and Industry has told us that this will be rescheduled. Don't let us forget that politicians, they have their own schedule. After all, Asiwaju Tinubu, he showed up at the session organized by the Coalition of Northern Forums. He was there. He was in Kano. We have seen him around. Okay? So if he says he has a schedule, he has certain, appointments that cannot accommodate the date chosen by the LCCI. The only thing we can ask for is that the two, his team and the LCCI team, in putting this private sector economic forum together, should choose a date that is convenient for both parties.
Yes.
Because you can't say because you are an organization, you insist on your own date. The candidate also, both parties have to align. So I don't think we can make any heavy weather out of that. But I understand your concern. You want to hear more and more from Asiwaju Bola Ahmed Tinubu. Maybe in doing so, maybe you are confessing, exposing your interest.
Doctor, please.
Okay, thank you.
Please, I beg.
No, not what he wants to get. His preference with his PVC.